is because we have a very special project that we've been working on for more than a year now. We have been writing a book about applying behavioral science to organizational change management. And this book will be published this year, hopefully in the second quarter by Wiley and Sons. We've been working with this publisher for a while. It's a big publisher, a whole new experience for us. You'll probably be able to see and pre-order soon. But these webinars are aimed at just giving you, the practitioners, the insights of what's going on in the book. How can you apply this? A little bit of a preview so that you can already see what we want to share with the world of business about behavioral science. So stay tuned for that book. And of course, these webinars are good because you don't have to wait too long to dive into these insights, because that's what we're going to do right now. Today, I'm going to share a lot of information with you that are all about interventions for narrative and communication. What are the evidence-based interventions from behavioral science that you can apply to become a more effective change communicator? We're going to talk about interventions like public narrative, the 33-33 rule, and mind space. And these are all evidence-based. They're backed in behavioral science and psychology. And we made sure that they've become very applicable and actionable for business purposes, and especially for organizational change management. If you have a big change going on in your organization, you have to communicate it the right way. And these are tools that can help you do that even more efficiently. One step back, why are we applying these evidence-based interventions to change management, or as we call it, behaviorally informed change management? The reason for that is the human brain and behavior is hardwired. It's designed in such a way that it resists change in predictable manners. And if you look at this from an evolutionary perspective, it makes tons of sense. Our brains were not designed thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago for the complex organizational and societal environment that we live in today. It was designed for survival. It was designed for reproduction. It was designed for protecting our own, and not for making very complex long-term decisions. So, of course, our brain developed and we became very good at this. But still, these old patterns, they're hardwired into our brain to resist change in predictable ways. This is making organizational change a very, very tough topic and a hard challenge, and makes it very important that you are aware of these psychological dimensions, the behavioral lens that will help you navigate this tough challenge in a more effective way. So one of the big problems in organizational change is that we have all these heuristics and sometimes even cognitive biases in our decision-making processes. And of course, I want to start with the fact that biases are, of course, not the only only barriers to successful change. Sometimes they're even very, very useful for change. There are all other types of contextual and behavioral barriers, but we like to look at cognitive biases as well because they pose very predictable challenges in change. Cognitive biases, you've probably heard of it before, or unconscious bias. We like to describe them as predictable patterns in our thinking that might result in errors in our decision making. So we have all these blind spots, we have all these shortcuts, all these mental shortcuts and heuristics in our minds that are very useful, especially when we were the way back in the day, thousands of years ago, when our ancestors were struggling to survive. But now, in the complex environment of today, sometimes these patterns, they result in predictable errors. They result in predictable ways in which we resist change or in which we make mistakes in our decision making. So biases are not always bad, definitely not, but they can get in the way of successful change. Problem with biases is that they're cognitive, so they're hardwired. It's the way that our brains are built. If you have a brain, you have bias, but they're also subconscious. So we don't see biases until we see the impact of a bias in the real world. That's why you can't observe them or measure them in a very effective way. And yeah, this is all so far so good, but the biggest problem with biases is that they are actually amplified by organizational factors. When you have a team that is working on a very specific problem, or is experiencing maybe some internal conflict, or is working across many cultures, these biases that may be harmless in an individual brain can become quite harmful in bigger organizational contexts. And that is why we have to pay a little bit of special attention to biases and other behavioral and cognitive barriers when it comes to organizational change. So How do you deal with those biases? You can try to take bias out of people. Of course, we tried. And you usually see this, things like debiasing training or diversity training, where you learn about biases and you become aware of biases, and you learn confirmation bias and anchoring bias and availability heuristic and all these thousands of names for biases. But the problem, usually these trainings don't really work very well. The data doesn't suggest that debiasing training poses the results that we look for. People are still making biased decisions, and bias is still causing harm in organizational processes. So that's a hint. What can we do to deal with bias? Aside from that, we can try to take bias out of processes. We can debias the environment in which we work, in which we make decisions, the process, the system, the policies, the culture, the context. And this sounds very vague, but we're going to dive into how to do that in just a bit. But I want you to remember that taking biases out of people is near impossible, but taking biases out of processes is very much possible. It's a lot easier and a lot more effective, especially when we're dealing with organizational change. The book that we've written, and we'll share all about it with you as soon as we get the green light for the publisher as well, contains 18 evidence-based interventions for 6 areas of change management. So we really try to dissect what change management challenges are, where they occur within the change management process, and how organizations can also make sense of this, from planning change and risk, our previous webinar, to narrative and communication, to how you can involve leaders to drive and support change, to how you can engage the broader stakeholder landscape, to how you can effectively measure change, and especially behavior change. See if whatever you're doing is moving the needle. And also learning and development. How can you make sure that an organization learns from change and owns change, and make sure that change becomes part of them, embrace it? These challenges all require a lot of effort, which is logical. And we tried to create a very specific and actionable toolbox around that. And these are what we call evidence-based interventions. So the book has 3 evidence-based interventions for each and every one of these change areas. And in these webinars, we're already previewing these interventions. We're going through them. We're making them applicable. We're learning you the steps. And of course, we didn't write the book for nothing. There's a whole, there are many hours, many days we can talk about these interventions, but we're going to do it now in a very concrete and clear manner. And we're going to focus on these interventions around narrative and communication. What can we do to improve the way that we talk about change, that we communicate change, and how we tell stories about change? We start with the first intervention called public narrative, which is one of my personal favorites. And probably these images evoke some type of meaning to you, a memory. We see Dr. King, we see Barack Obama, and we also see Schwarzenegger in 3 very famous speeches. Well, you probably know the first 2. And the speech with Schwarzenegger was briefly after the Russia-Ukraine war started. And now these are radically different contexts. They're radically different moments in time, and they're also different people. But even their speeches were completely different. But what was the same was the underlying structure of the story that they were telling. They were using, whether they knew it or not, a psychological technique and intervention called the public narrative. And what we have found is that this public narrative is incredibly effective when it comes to communicating change and motivating people. There's a lot of data that's backing this up. The big consultancies have rolled out thousands of surveys, and the data is quite unanimous. And especially this highlights from a big, it was a McKinsey study that surveyed more than 1,000, almost 2,000 employees in different companies. And they found that if there's a change in which leaders are communicating openly and honestly about how the change is progressing, what is going on, setbacks, wins, these changes are 8 times more likely to succeed. And then even more in depth, if they use a consistent change story or narrative to align these organizations and the people that work with around the change goals, around the objectives, there's another 3.8 times more likely succession chances of those changes. So we see very quantifiable numbers that tell us the way in which narrative, in which communication, in which storytelling really raises the chances of success when it comes down to change in organizations. What does that look like in practice? So From a psychological perspective, public narrative, telling a good story makes perfect sense because storytelling, it creates empathy, it creates unity, it also creates urgency. It wants us to act if it's told well. It helps us overcome mental barriers and uncertainties that people might have, or aversions, or even hostility against change. And of course, change is more than just storytelling, but storytelling plays a very big part in it. And one of the reasons for that is because it persuades on both the emotional and the rational level. So storytelling is to our hearts, but it's also to our brains. And in that way, this is often referred to as the narrative bias. Humans are storytelling creatures. We don't work with loose bits and pieces of information. We're tuned to stories. We're tuned to storytelling and making sense of the world around us. So from that perspective, public narrative and storytelling makes sense on both a quantifiable perspective in which it works on organizational change objectives. And from a psychological perspective, it also makes perfect sense. So now let's dive into that technique. Public narrative. It is probably the prime work of Marshall Guns, a Harvard professor who I deeply admire, and he's the one that set up this framework. And it consists out of three stories. You have the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And I highly recommend you to go watch that Dr. King or Obama or Schwarzenegger speech and see how they integrate the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. I'm not sure if everyone that tells the public narrative is aware that they're using this technique, but it's such a powerful one. So why is it powerful? When you tell a story of self, when you tell what your purposes are, what your journey has been to this change, what people can expect from you, and how this personally means a lot to you as a leader or as a storyteller, you create empathy between you and the listener. The listener that might first feel, distance to you, can recognize themselves in you. There's a bridge that is being built. It's the power of empathy. And you can find a lot of ways in which you can tell this story of self. Again, this is a structure. It's not a mandate. So you're very free in the way in which you tell this. Then there's the story of us. You move from, your own role, creating empathy, to creating unity. What stories can you tell in the context of organizational change about how we are in this together, how the different stakeholder groups are linked, what common goals are, what the sense of shared identity is? How can you build that group feeling, that in-group feeling that we know so well in psychology? That's the power of storytelling that you apply to the story of us. And so now you've created empathy, you've created unity, and now you're going to create urgency by moving to the story of now. And this is where your change story takes on a very actionable edge that talks about what the current challenges are, what we can do if we act now, what we might miss out on if we don't act now, and also how we can take action, and with a concrete call to action. So these three stories, the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now, are one of the most powerful underlying frameworks or foundations to every story that you can tell. And especially when it comes to organizational change, this is often forgotten. People dive into the details, people dive into the data, people dive into the statistics. I've seen so many senior leaders take such a logical and rational approach to change communication. But this is what should be at the heart of a good change story: story of self, story of us, and story of now. And you can find tons of information about this on the internet with prompts and examples. So definitely go look for that. The book will also help you there. And now you understand what a strong foundation looks like for a story. So moving on. Another intervention, which is what we call the 33-33 rule. And often that last three is omitted, and I'll tell you later why that is. And this is a completely different intervention for change communication, because it doesn't so much tell you about storytelling structures and foundations. It tells you way more about the format, the scale of a story. And basically, it contains three different types of stories. You have a 30-minute version, a 3-minute version, and a 30-second version, and maybe even a 3-second version. And the way that you want to tell these different formats of stories, you have the same story, but you translate it, you condense it, or you expand it. You tell a 30-minute version or a 3-minute version, 30-second version. You can balance information like that. You can avoid too much or too little, depending on who you're talking to. It's also great for you to, as a leader or as a change communicator, to adapt to different contexts. Maybe you don't have that much time, or maybe you have tons of time. You want to be able to scale your story. And in this way, you can communicate a bit more effectively, especially when you're in an organizational change that happens very fast, that happens together with other changes, that limits you on time. And usually this is pretty much true for all big organizational changes. So that's where this tool comes in handy. You have three versions, as I said. You have imagine you use the public narrative to create a beautiful story. And if you look at Dr. King's speech or Obama's speech or Arnold's speech, they were all about 30 minutes long, 20 to 30 minutes. But you want to be able to condense that. You want to be able to have a 3-minute version and a 30-second version as well. You want to change your narrative for different audiences. So let's go through to all of them quite briefly, and I'll tell you a bit about what is useful in what context. The 30-minute version is, the fully fleshed out version of your change story. This is great for senior leaders that speak at a town hall or all hand meetings where all stakeholders are involved. A change might be communicated for the first time. People are looking for detailed information, the meaning behind it, the purpose. You want to go in full depth to empathy, unity, and urgency, the three stories. People want the reasons for change. They want to know what is changing, what is not changing. And they also, of course, want to be able to ask questions about that. They want to make sure that they can, that there is a Q&A. So that's where the 30-minute version of your story might be best. Then there's a 3-minute version. You cannot always take half an hour or always have a senior leader do a detailed narrative about an organizational change. But you want to be able to take that message and condense the key parts of it into 3 minutes. So this is great, for example, when you have managers, change managers that are driving a change, but have to present how it's going to senior leadership or to a board or to the C-suite. You want to do it in just enough time. You want to have about 3 minutes where you can recap the key points, the progress. You focus on the key message, the impacts that you want to achieve, and you avoid these unnecessary details. But still, in 3 minutes, you can still tackle those three stories. Then we go to a 30-second version. This is where it gets a bit more really condensed. When we have senior leaders communicating change, or you have change managers that are updating different teams about change, you also want change agents, change champions, people that are involved in the change to be able to tell that story. So this is where the 30-second version is very handy. I always talk about this like a bit of an elevator pitch almost. You want to be able to quickly outline what is concisely the key goal of these changes. Why are we doing it? What's the rationale behind it? What are we missing out on if we don't do it? What will we gain if we do it? What is the call to action? What is expected? Purely the most important information. So this is where you have that 30-minute version at first, and you want to be able to condense it down to 30 seconds. And this is where change managers come in so handy. They can help senior leaders, they can help communicators condense and expand change narratives in a very dynamic way. So 33-30, that's usually where most organizations leave it at, but you can also go to a 3-second version. You can turn your entire 30-minute narrative into a motto. And the example that I talked to you about way in the beginning about Barack Obama and his NTC speech in, was it 2007? Of course, he did the same. He turned the entire story into this presidential model. Yes, we can. And there are many other examples of that. That's even shorter than 3 seconds. But to recap, you have your narrative that should be a very powerful story about whatever change it is you are encountering as an organization or as a group or as a team. And it should contain at least these foundational elements: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now, the public narrative framework. And then when you have that story and you tell it and you could collect feedback and you adapt it based on where you are in the change, based on stakeholder feedback, you want to be able to tell it in the right format. You want to have a 30-minute version, a 3-minute version, a 30-second version, and maybe even a 3-second version, so that every stakeholder can talk about change and communicate it adequately, regardless of how many time there is available. So pick the right frame for the right context. Okay, so I'm aware that we're blazing through this quite quickly. And of course, there is a lot to these interventions and a lot of step-by-step guides and manuals. You can find a lot of information online. We have some in-depth videos about these as well. And of course, the book is coming, which is a great help. But I want to talk to you about one last intervention that can be very useful as almost like a checklist for your change communication or your narrative. And this is referred to as the mind space framework. Now, Mindspace, if there's anyone here that has affinity with behavioral science, this should sound very familiar to you. It's a framework that was invented and designed by the behavioral insights team, which are the formal partners of governments around the world to help them change behavior and apply behavioral science. And ever since then, it's been a super popular tool in government policy communication. But it can also be very, very handy in change management, in organizational change. Mindspace is an acronym. Each letter stands for one dimension: messenger, incentive, norms, defaults, salience, priming, affect, commitment, and ego. We're going to go through all of them really quickly so that you understand. And each of these dimensions is one of these principles from behavioral science that has been very robust throughout the year. So we have tons and tons of articles and papers and data on incentives, norms, default, salience, priming, etc. And what the behavioral insights team did is they made that into something very practical and actionable that is designed for practitioners. So this is based on thousands and thousands of academic papers, but it's not designed for academics or scientists. It's designed for practitioners that have to communicate. And I like to use Mindspace as a bit of a checklist. So imagine you have applied the public narrative that we talked about, and you have a very, very strong piece of communication, very strong narrative, and you have all these versions, and you just want to check whether you're hitting the right spots in terms of behavior, whether you're hitting the right spots in terms of persuasion and influence. And this is a great way to do that. So starting with Messenger, we're going to go past all these letters, right? Mindspace, starting with at Messenger. This is all about who is communicating. So of course you can have a very powerful story, but if the communicator is not credible within a team or an organization, it's going to be very hard to get the message across. So it's important that you look for trusted individuals, stakeholders that have a lot of credibility and influence that can help you spread a message or help you communicate it. Then the second letter of the Mindspace acronym, incentives. Incentives are these powerful drivers of behaviors that motivate us to do something or don't do something. And if you are aware of the different incentives in your organization or in your team, maybe stakeholder group A wants to go in this direction because there is something motivating them, and stakeholder B wants to go in a completely different direction because they have very different incentives. There are way different motivators. You want to have a map of this, and you want to be able to address the key incentives of the group that you're talking to by highlighting losses, potential gains, potential losses, what we miss out on if we don't act, what we can gain if we do act. And if you can tailor to different groups and incentives, your message will be way more likely to stick and motivate. The third letter is norms in the Mindspace acronym. Now, you all know what norms are, social norms. They're these powerful social drivers. We're group animals in the end, humans, that drive our behavior in a social way. So you can leverage this in hundreds of different ways, but by talking about what the organization is doing, what a part of the organization is already doing right, how social norms are changing, how more and more people are converting to behavior A or B. If you highlight the social dynamics, the social norms, it will become way more easy for people to conform to that in a positive and lasting way. And you can also do this by role modeling, right? As if you were a manager or a leader or just, a very active change agent in your team. If you role model the desired behavior and you have different role models doing that, the social norms will play in your favor. So it's great to address that in communication as well. Then we go to defaults. We're in the Mindspace acronym. We're at the letter D right now. Defaults are one of the most powerful tools in the toolkit of the behavioral scientist and also of the change manager, because it helps you form the environment around decisions, the choice architecture, as we name it. Now, of course, there's only so much you can do with defaults in communication, but you can, for example, talk about new behaviors as if they are going to be the new normal, as if they are already the default course of action, as if it's for leadership and the change champions around them, as if it's already second nature to adjust these behaviors. It's the default for them. This can be very powerful in communication too. And you can make it a lot easier for stakeholders to adopt new behaviors. There's so many examples that could be, if you transition to a new HRM software, if there's a leadership transition, If you have a diversity and inclusion program running, there are all these new behaviors that need to be adopted. And if you facilitate the new behaviors, if you make them very easy to do, people can start doing them by default almost, which is very powerful in communication too. We move to the letter S in the Mindspace acronym, which is salience. And salience is a very popular topic in cognitive neuropsychology as well. It's all about what grabs our attention. Something that is salient is something that grabs our attention, that is memorable. Now, when you're storytelling, you can use so many tactics for this, right? You can use multi-sensory storytelling. You can really draw people in to the image that you're working towards. We've even worked with change managers that get professional artists that draw the new situation, that draw the new landscape of change, that help people really visualize what is going to happen. But this is also something that you can do with simple storytelling, right? You can make certain elements that are very key stand out. There's many techniques that you can use for this. I'm sure that you have the creativity to do this on your own, but it's something to think about. Are the key points in my message salient enough so that they're memorable and that they're actionable? Good. Almost there. We're in the Mindspace acronym, and we go to the letter P, which stands for priming. Now, priming is a bit of a slippery slope in psychological research, but it's very clear that our brain and mind is influenced by subtle cues that are below the threshold of consciousness, but that have a big impact on our behavior. So when you're in organizational change, you're driving that change, what are subtle cues that you can use to enhance your message? Might it be the way in which you convey the message? Might it be the way that your slides look? It could be something like that. It could be something as simple as that. It might be that your change is associated to a new location, that you're moving buildings. What can you do there in the environment to prime people to be receptive for the change? And again, I know this can be very abstract if we don't go into a detailed context, but I want you to think about this. What are subtle cues, almost subliminal cues that you could convey to your listener to get them in the right frame of mind, to make them receptive, to make them open and positive to change? And there's many language tools that you can use here as well. Incorporate language that is positive, that is action oriented. You probably have heard of growth mindset before. We're going to have a webinar about that in the future as well. There's a whole growth mindset language toolkit that we also describe in the book in depth. That goes into how you can use priming in your vocabulary to make sure that people become more receptive to a message that slightly changes their mindset in such a way that they become change champions as well, that they're on board with a change and not too hostile or disengaged. And we just have a short webinar today, so I can't go into too much detail, but we will have another webinar that goes way in depth on this as well. Okay. As I said, almost there. We're in the Mindspace acronym at the letter A, which stands for affect. And affect is often associated with emotion. It's not exactly the same as emotion, but let's not go into those details right now. Affect is about considering what people will feel when you're storytelling. And this is very important to do for different stakeholder groups in your audience. If you have a message, it might be very positively received by one group, but it might completely trigger the other group in a wrong way. So make sure that you're aware of this. Make sure that you're aware of the different sentiments in your organization, of the different worries that people might have, of benefits and opportunities that people might see, and use this in your narrative and storytelling. Tailor to emotion, not just to reason. The C in Mindspace stands for commitment. When we see that other people are committed, or when we can get, for example, managers or senior leaders to commit to a change, they're way more likely to follow through. So this is where leaders and managers play a huge role. When you can get these stakeholders that have a more senior role to commit to a change, especially when it's publicly, if they approve this message almost, it's going to be so much easier, not just for them to follow through, but also for others to follow them. So this is about leading by example. This is about having powerful commitment and having people openly commit to a change, but in an authentic way, only if they're behind it and only if they can own it and follow up as well. And lastly, this Mindspace acronym, I know it's quite long, but you can use this as a checklist to see do I check every one of these boxes in my communication? The last one is about ego, which is, it has some negative connotations from time to time, but it's very closely related to affect as well. when we are in an organizational change, it will benefit some stakeholders. It will not be beneficial to other stakeholders. This is almost always the case. And what is very important that people who might be negatively afflicted by a change, that you make sure that this doesn't impact them personally, that you can help them also save face where possible, that you can leave them within their full dignity, and they don't have to be fully on board or fully agreeing with a change. That will never be the case. But it's very important that in your communication, and not just the primary communication, but in all your communication channels and strategy, that you have a respectful way of framing your message, that it tailors to the dignity of all the stakeholder groups, and that it helps people not lose their face, right? Not lose face, and that you keep their ego intact as well. It's something that is often overlooked, but something that can be very, very detrimental to the success of change management. Okay, so mind space and all the components that come with it. You'll probably have some, it's an exercise to remember them all just by the acronym. But again, there are many materials available online. This is, as I said, it's an intervention that is designed by the Behavioral Insights team. They have a really good white paper on this as well that can help you tailor this to your change communication. And in the book, we give a lot of tips on how you can do this in the specific context of change management. So, a lot of information your way. I'm very aware of that. We talked about 3 interventions: public narrative, 3333, and mind space. Honestly, we barely scratched the surface of what you can do with these interventions and how detailed you can use them and involve other stakeholders as well. But we'll do a lot of other webinars about this as well, and we hope to see you there too. But for today, I want to leave it at that in terms of information that I'm sending your way. And a question, we're going to go to Q&A, but a question that I wanted to address up front is whenever we are teaching this in master classes or workshops or in consulting projects, people can have the question, where do I find time to apply all this? I'm already so busy. I'm not sure if we have time to create a whole public narrative, to have all these different versions of my story, and to remember all these the acronym in the Mindspace framework. And that's very true. And you don't have to start with everything at once. Nothing is mandatory here. What we have found to work very well in practice is to start small. So, for example, you have existing communication templates, you have an existing narrative. What elements of these interventions, what elements of public narrative or of the Mindspace framework can you apply? And if you have a 30-minute version, then can you at least make a 3-minute version as well, And if you're a change manager, this is very helpful because it will put you in the role where you support and engage tons of other stakeholders. And as I said, use existing materials for this, use existing processes, use existing meetings and trainings to discuss this. And in this way, you'll find that you can, in a quite low threshold way, apply these behavioral interventions and really heap the benefits out of them as well, which is the last point: experiment. Don't just, go full throttle on these interventions and throw a big budget against it and hope that it works. Start small and experiment, and see whether this is something that works in your context, in your organization, with your unique culture and your team. And if you find that it works, you collect some initial data. This could be qualitative, right? This could be just people saying, hey, this public narrative really moved a lot of people in the audience of this change. Then see if you can scale it up. Then see if you can bring it into a broader context of the organization. So start small, experiment, collect proof, and work your way up from there. Good. Well, that was a lot of information for lunch, but thank you so much for your attention and efforts. And I want to switch to Q&A now. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will also stop the recording here. And then I will be here to address any questions that you might have.